Welcome to Hub Hits. I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of the Hub. PM Carney will select his cabinet tomorrow morning. All eyes are on Rideau Hall as he once again will make his decisions around who should form his government. To parse those decisions, I am joined by Scott Reid. He is a principal and co-founder at Feschuk.Reid and a former communications director for Prime Minister Paul Martin. Scott, how's it going?
Hey, just great, Harrison. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So, what should we make of the decisions that are being made here? Is there going to be a major tonal shift in terms of differences between the Trudeau government, or you're keeping things within the party and it will be somewhat similar?
I don't think it'll be very similar. If you take your cue from the election campaign, I would say the first half of the campaign really worked for Carney, not just because Trump was barreling through our television screens and phones all the time and setting the agenda, but also because Carney channeled a kind of un-Trudeau energy. And I think the second half of the campaign, where it started to feel a little bit more conventional, where that sharp difference with the previous government was less obvious, took them off track. And so I think you're going to see very much a Mark Carney tone, a Mark Carney focus. And in particular, I think that means it's going to be very action-oriented, very much born of crisis, seizing the moment and saying, look, we have to rewire our relationship with the United States, maybe rewire our entire economy and our relationship with the rest of the world. So we need to move rapidly, we need to move now. And I think that's going to be the tone. It will, in that sense, feel like, I think, quite different than Trudeau.
You write in the Hub, this will be perhaps a crisis-built government. What does a crisis-built government look like?
Well, I think it's one where you say we are in crisis. See that astonishing definition?
You say the thing
look,
out
I
loud,
think that I think you could have this past election 100 times, and 99 of them would yield a defeat for the incumbent government.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it yielded a Carney victory is because we are in a crisis, because Donald Trump has decided to explode all of the norms, all of the fundamental underlying relationships, and our reliability on those norms and relationships, economically, security-wise, and then, of course, all the ripples that sends out around the world. And as a consequence, it's left Canadians saying, well, who is best qualified to help guide us through this time of disruptive and distressing change? Who is perfectly suited to try to make these decisions, balance these trade-offs, build new relationships? And Carney emerged on the scene almost as a tailor-made, purpose-built prime minister for that moment. And I think that the cabinet and the cabinet transition will be built very much around that same respect. So I think it's seizing this notion of crisis and saying, this is the defining and driving factor. And I think you'll see that probably in the priorities that he sets out, not just the people he picks. The people he picks only mean so much to so many of us, but the priorities he sets and how those priorities are reflected in his cabinet choices and the mission that they are assigned, I think is what's going to really matter.
Does the government need to be sustained, Scott, by this Trump pot boiling in the background constantly, that crisis in the back of our minds? Or can it be equally sustained by having a victory with the Trump government and returning more to normal? Which is a better outcome for the Carney government that's being formed tomorrow?
I think I'd say two things to that. One, obviously, nobody wishes to sustain crisis. You don't want to artificially perpetuate anxiety, uncertainty, and all the harm that comes from that. So I don't think you're going to see the government saying it's in our interest if we can just, keep this this terrifying moment going as long as possible. You're there to solve it, and let's rely on the assumption that if you have some success in solving or at least progressing against that challenge, you'll be rewarded. But I would also say this. I think that Carney recognizes, maybe uniquely, and I mentioned in the beginning of my piece, a sort of five very kind of Carney-esque, kind of five very simple, straightforward, flatly expressed words that nevertheless say quite a bit in my view, where he says, no Carney and no crisis, no Mark Carney. And I think that is his working assumption, and that is we live in a moment of crisis, And we know what that means for governments because they've occurred over the years now and then. It means that the public will lend you permission as a government and as leaders to take decisions that would otherwise be denied, to do things that you would not be permitted to do in normal times. And I think that Carney looks at that and says, I've got it somewhere based on history, a 6 to 18 month window. And one, I got to resolve things as best as I can with the United States. And two, I have to prepare Canada for a world in which we can never again go back to assuming that we will live under the blanket of their economic or security arrangements. And so that means changing a lot of things. That's going to require some hardship. That's going to require some difficult choices and trade-offs. And you're only going to get those things done and through in this kind of window of 6 to 18 months. So I think you're going to see him move quite boldly, quite dramatically. I think he's going to be a radical prime minister. I really do. And I mean that in a good and a bad way. Like, I think people that voted for him, there will be some people who will be like, holy moly, I didn't imagine you would do this. I just like the way he dressed up as compared to Trump. But I think he's going to be a radical prime minister. I don't think there's a lot of hesitate and wait about this guy.
How do you think he, as a Liberal prime minister, responds to this whole, there's all these questions around Western alienation, Western representation, Western separation? How does he take in your words, a radical approach towards that, change the tone there?
Yeah, it strikes me that he's a real lid on the pot kind of leader. I mean, if you take a look at this election campaign, he could have made political hay out of a bunch of this talk. He could have used Danielle Smith and her rhetoric and her example as something to lever greater number of seats in central Canada and elsewhere. And I think he laid off a bunch of those pitches. There weren't too many times where he really.
There was a little bit of joking around Smith, but not, yeah.
There was there was essentially the joke at the microphone, which I think was probably ill-considered. And I noticed that it was never repeated. And so I think he's very careful on that. But he could have easily, and people suspected, and some people speculated publicly, that the Liberals would run a classic kind of 1980s campaign where it would be, really trying to dunk on the West in order to, harness a ton of seats in central Canada. And he's resisted that. So I think when I say lid on the pot, I mean, I think he's the kind of guy who's going to de-escalate tensions. I think he's the kind of guy that's going to not respond to every aggravation and every overture by Danielle Smith. So the first thing is I think he'll be kind of calm. I think he's going to be a bit of a carpeted wall against which some of these sounds are thrown. The second thing is I think that people are going to be surprised the degree to which he's going to place energy infrastructure at the center of his time as prime minister. It's a great example of something that people will give you permission to do in a time of crisis, to get big things built, to get big things done, but they won't tolerate it forever. All those important offsetting considerations really come to the fore when that cloud of crisis has passed. And so I think you're going to see that he's going to move and move quickly, and that will give at least the energy. I don't know about Danielle Smith, because half of this has got to do with her internal politics, UCP, how her party in her voter coalition wants to constantly see her feeding that beast. But I think the oil patch and the energy sector will find plenty to be satisfied about if they give the guy a little bit of room to maneuver, because I think he's going to take it.
We shall see. Any names that our viewers might not be aware of that you think could be getting a tap tomorrow that weren't part of that, whatever, Trudeau class of 2015, et cetera? The people in the picture, but behind him now, I guess this is his cabinet.
I'll give you two, and there's likely to be more, but because I do think that he's going to. I suspect, and who the hell knows, like trying to predict cabinets is just waiting to be proven wrong. But I think he's going to err on the side of change, or at least a greater sense of change and continuity. I think new will win over experience, because again, if this is a crisis-built government, then that means you bring in new talent, and you know what? If they break some eggs or if they stumble, you deal with it. And I make reference to that in the column. Like if people need help, you give it to them. If they are not up to the job, well, then you replace them, and you don't cry a bunch of tears. I think Tim Hodgson, who is the former chair of Hydro One, a guy who's proven that he can get infrastructure built, a guy who's proven that he can secure social license from communities and from stakeholders. And I think he's going to be a guy that you're going to see in a prominent position. I don't know which one it will be. I don't know, energy, maybe infrastructure, something where you'll be able to harness his unique set of experiences. And it's not so much his business experience, and it's not so much his experience of finance and his familiarity uh, with Mark Carney. It is his singular experience at getting something done that people expected couldn't be done. I think that is a quality that Mark Carney is looking for and counting on. So I'd watch for Tim Hodgson to be given an important responsibility. I'd also watch for Carlos Leite out of Quebec City, who was tapped by Carney to run. I would not be surprised if they put him like right to the top into the finance portfolio. He was Philip Couillard's finance minister for 4 years. That was a well-managed treasury, and I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a nod for finance or treasury board or something that harnesses his unique managerial financial skills.
Because this is the thing, you talk about tapping people, and I raised this to you over email. I'm interested in this, like, which of these theories is more true? This idea that, Carney's just been rolling with the punches, keeping his head above water. He faced prime minister resignation right before he might have become finance minister. That turned into a leadership race, then a general election. Versus this is someone who spent the last decade assembling what he thinks is a crack squad, and he's now, I know you love comic books, Scott, behind you,
I
putting
do,
up a the
as you can
Carney
see.
signal for his team to assemble now.
I'm not going to suggest that the guy didn't have his eye on the possibility of running for prime minister, but he
That's for sure.
also didn't he didn't jump in. You know what I mean? Like he spent a long time sort of going, well, I'm going to wait for my moment. And for most people, they wait and they wait and then nothing happens. And then they realize in their rocking chair that the moment had passed and that's that. He waited. And when this moment came, he seized it and he slipped into the spotlight in a way that worked. I mean, it worked. And, there's a lot of not voting for Trudeau. There's a lot of not voting for Polyev. There's a lot of not voting for Trump. But there's a fair bit of voting for Carney and his unique demeanor and experience and resume. And so, like, I don't really know how to answer your question other than I think the guy fits the moment. If he didn't, he wouldn't have gotten elected. I don't think that he's had some master plan where he's been waiting around forever. And he's always, I think this guy's a utilitarian, and I do think that's why he's going to be a radical prime minister because it's in a moment of crisis. That's opened the door to his possibility. That possibility is made him prime minister. And I think he's going to be ruthlessly utilitarian. And all of those senior public servants and all of those people that we appointed to cabinet tomorrow, I think they're going to be living on a short leash. I think
Really?
the new boss ain't the same as the old boss. And if there are not results as he determines them being realized, people will be pushed and then pushed out because I think that he is a utilitarian and he's looking for W's on the board. And I think that's going to be a very different tone.
So one of the things you say in your piece is like permit your ministers to stand on their own. Parliamentary government ought not to be the unchecked. I love this line. The unchecked province of the PMO. How does he? How is he a ruthless utilitarian and operate that form of control with all what seems to be governing incentives for that central control to grow and grow and grow, limitation of risks, but at the same time you're saying allow cabinet ministers to flourish, etc. Like how do you have control while relinquishing control at the same time?
Well, you don't, but you lend people the freedom to fail, and ideally, the opportunity to succeed. So, two things. One, if we start with the crisis thesis, I do think that he's going to give people clear, prescribed mandates and an instruction to go execute against that. And so that's how you dictate control. That's how you establish control by telling people, I have trust in you. Now go do this. What you don't want, and where I think PMO has gotten into trouble in the past, is then by babysitting the manner in which they do it constantly. And so, yes, you have to assume a level of risk. I would remind you, I worked in a PMO, right? I worked with Chrétien's PMO when I was at finance for years and years and years, and then I served for 2.5, 3 years in the prime minister's office. So this is a little bit like, um, the drunkard telling people to clean their act up. But I, I really think that one of the challenges with first the Harper PMO and then intensified under Trudeau was that they weren't content to let ministers establish themselves independently. And so, and I'll give you, and I mentioned this in the column, I'll give you a mechanical example. I'll give you a machinery of government example. In my day, chiefs of staff to a minister answered to, wait for it, the minister. That's it. Under the Trudeau government, you had this dual reporting structure where chiefs of staff answered to the minister, but then also to the prime minister's chief of staff. I think that's screwed up. That imposes a level of central control. It's going to obviously culturally dictate a look over the shoulderism that will haunt a government. And if you're a minister, it sends a signal that um, the trust and confidence of your own office is not perhaps entirely yours.
Yeah,
That
they're like spying on you, your younger
it's
underling.
somehow well, not spying on, but it's bifurcated.
Yeah.
And we've seen examples of how that broke down and led to disastrous outcomes. So my argument is this. I mean, one thing that I thought was terrific about pardon me, one thing that I thought was terrific about the way Mr. Chrétien ran his governments was he knew what two, three, four things he wanted to focus on. And then he said of his ministers, you guys go out and do the rest. And if you screw up, I'll fire you. Right. Well, frankly,
There's
if
the
you screw
balance
up, I'll
we're
help
talking
you.
about.
And if you
Yeah.
really screw up, I'll fire you. But he didn't tell them how. And that's what I think Carney can exert control by A, telling them what to do, and B, holding them to the account for whether or not they do it, but not by dictating how. And one small thing again, and I'm getting into nerd political culture here, let those ministers grow. Let independent polls of authority and influence happen. When Pierre Trudeau was a cabinet minister, you had titans, you had giants, right? You had a John Monroe out of Hamilton, and you had, Andre Ouellette in Quebec, and you had people that had independent authority. And sometimes that created tension, but that also ensured that the only voice that mattered wasn't simply the PMO. And I think letting ministers be ministers and letting the chips fall away there where they may, it would be a good approach, particularly when you're in a crisis, because you can't dictate and micromanage everything.
Just lastly, Scott, humor me with this. This is something you had to deal with when you were in office. It's something Trudeau came into office saying that there would no longer be any hyphenated liberals, that there should be no more factionalism. Are those wounds healed? Are there Trudeau movement liberals that exist? Are there still Martinites there? Or is there sort of a cohesive whole now when we look at this government that's being formed?
Well, I don't know about a cohesive whole. I think that everybody knows Mark Carney is the boss. So I think that's clearly established. There are no challengers. There's no independent rivalries, all that kind of stuff. So that's thing number one. That's a different time than, than we had throughout the time that Mr. Chrétien was there, and he was always pecking at John Turner's back, or then, he had to worry about Paul Martin and all that kind of stuff. But, I always hated this hyphenated liberal bullshit because you know what? It is good to have healthy competition within a caucus and a cabinet. It is a good thing, provided the leader is in charge. And from my perspective, those idea of old rivalries, you ask me, do any of them exist? Are there such a thing as Martin liberals anymore? The Liberal Party is always going to be, if it's operating well, it's going to be a broad coalition. It is a true it is a true brokerage party that invites in people that would be comfortable in provincial New Democratic governments, and would also be equally comfortable in progressive conservative cabinets. I like that. That is a good thing. That isn't the only cleavage or the only fault line, but that's one of the important ones. You've always had that under successful governments that are liberal because they squeeze everything else out to the margins. The factionalism, it wasn't Trudeau who ended that. It was Michael Ignatieff. He burnt the party to the ground. There was nothing left but ash. So Martin liberals, Chrétien liberals, all that stuff, that all died in 2011 because the party itself faced an existential threat. And, it's not said often in this site, perhaps, but hats off to Trudeau for finding a way to magically revive that through effectively the force of his own personality.
Mm-hmm. That is Scott Reid, principal and co-founder of Feschuk.Reid and former communications director for Prime Minister Paul Martin. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Harrison.